All right, we'll give it a minute or two for other people to log in, and then we'll get down to work. Of course, I forgot to send the handout to YouTube. Sorry, let me take care of that. Okay, that's over there, that's over there. I suppose I should share the handout in the Zoom chat. Of course, you can read along on screen, but it's nice to be able to go back and review. All right, that's a little too big, but stop that. All right, let's go ahead and get started with our new book of study today. That is to say, the book of Devarim, also known as Deuteronomy, the final book of the collection that we call the Torah, the first 5 books, and the book that is written most wholly in Moses' own words. That is to say, although he is certainly still speaking with divine inspiration, he seems to have been the more taking an active role in shaping the words that are recapturing some of the events that have led up to this point, restating some of the commandments that are needed as we are about to move into the land of Israel, and generally putting his own stamp on this work that we call the Torah. And we're going to start today, interestingly enough, at the beginning of Deuteronomy 1:1. And we're going to see how he begins to reframe this whole section. It is, of course, from the second word of the first verse, Devarim, that the book is given its title in the Hebrew. Someone says text is very small. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, good. I got it right. All right. Good morning to everyone. I guess now technically good afternoon to everyone on the YouTube. I'll be checking the chat from time to time. Do not panic if I don't see your comment right away. So let's get going. These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan, through the wilderness in the Arabah near Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lavan, and Chatzerot, and Dizahav. So before we get into what they're talking about with this list of locations, just a reminder of where we are. We have finally, after 40 years, reached the eastern bank of the Jordan River, somewhere in the middle of what would now be the modern state of Israel, looking across to Israel, and Moses is giving his final speech of his leadership, well, his almost final speech. That is to say, there are a few speeches contained throughout the whole book of Deuteronomy, but really you could lump this all together as one big address. And he is giving them a little bit of a recap. Right? So from these different places, it is 11 days from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir route. So he's saying it's an 11-day walk from Horeb, which is the other word that's used for Mount Sinai. So he's saying to get to the edge of Israel is 11 days. And then verse 3 drives home that fact. It was in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, that Moses addressed the Israelites in accordance with the instructions that the Lord had given him for them. So there's a little bit of an aside, which we will come back to in our commentary, so I'm not going to talk about it too much right now, that it takes 11 days to get from Mount Sinai to the edge of Israel. And then verse 3 tells us it has taken them 40 years. 40 years versus 11 days is quite a difference, and one that will need explaining when we get to our commentary. After he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtaroth at Edrei, these are the commandments that God has told Moses to give after those events. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching. He said, we're now in verse 6, "The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain." Right? God had to give us the command after having been encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai for a considerable length of time, that it was time to break camp and head up to the land of Israel. "Start out and make your way to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arava, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates." Right? So basically head up into the land of Israel, and you're going to be inhabiting this area roughly demarcated by these landmarks. "See, I place the land at your disposal. Go, take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to them and their heirs after them." Right? So God is saying, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Now, at that time, Moses is also including a different event during the travels. "Thereupon I said to you, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself," meaning the nation of Israel. "The Lord your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. It is hard to lead a huge group. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised you. How can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering?" Sort of the defining qualities of our people at that time, and we have unfortunately not entirely shed the reputation for having numerous quarrels. Now, a good amount of arguing is healthy because it means that more points of view are being shared and that people are discussing them. However, for one person to try and rein that in and make sure it doesn't become poisonous, that is beyond the capabilities of even one person, says Moses. And if the people continue to increase, as they should, what is he going to do? So, verse 13 tells us, "Pick from each of your tribes men who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads." You answered me and said, "What you propose to do is good." So I took your tribal leaders, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over you, chiefs of thousands, chiefs of hundreds, chiefs of 50s, and chiefs of 10s, and officials for your tribes. Now, if that sounds familiar from our previous readings of the Torah, absolutely. If you go back into the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, and find Parashat Yitro, the section that details Jethro coming to visit Moses after the Exodus, you will notice that verse 15 is very much what Jethro advised for Moses to do. Now, do we say then that Moses is taking credit for Jethro's idea? Do we say that Jethro didn't actually suggest it, but Moses did? Which text is right? We're not going to focus on this in our commentary, so I'll just give you a little bit of an aside, and then I highly recommend you reading more commentary on your own, which you can always find at this website, Sefaria, which is to say that there is a general feeling that in Moses' speech in Deuteronomy, Moses is retelling previous events in ways that highlight or emphasize new lessons from them, not to contradict the previous telling of those events, but to point out that he is telling them in a way that is most essential for that generation, the generation about to enter the land of Israel, and that they will hear a lesson that they might have missed if they were to have only recounted the original telling, in this case, in the book of Exodus. So what is he trying to say here? He is trying to say, first of all, that the people agreed to this, right? That he proposed it to them, and that they agreed, and that he did it because of the internal turmoil. it wasn't just to save himself, which is sort of what it sounded like in the book of Exodus with Jethro's suggestion that Moses was too tired and burnt out, but that instead it was for the benefit of the community and of a necessity because the community is difficult to lead. That is going to be very important for them to keep in mind as they are about to experience a change of leadership. As Moses passes on and Joshua takes over, the people are going to have to continue to respect their leaders in order for there to be a smooth transition. Verse 16 continues, I charged your magistrates at that time as follows. Hear out your fellow men and decide justly between any man and a fellow Israelite or a stranger. You shall not be partial in your judgment. Hear out low and high alike. Fear no man, for judgment is God's. And any matter that is too difficult for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it. Thus I instructed you at that time about the various things you should do. So again, Moses is emphasizing here the organization of the people into a judicial system that does have a hierarchy that will allow greater courts to hear more difficult cases up to all the way to the top, being Moses at the time and later replaced by Joshua. All right, any questions on the basic text as we have discussed? And then we are going to go into our commentary to look at our 11-day journey. Checking over on YouTube. Yes, John.
Rabbi, I have a question about verse 17. Is that reflecting from Parashat Kedoshim? Where you shall not defer to the great nor give partiality to the poor?
Exactly. So it's also bringing in that idea, and one that is repeated in numerous different ways throughout the Torah, that justice needs to be impartial, meaning that if somebody is mighty, you don't give deference to them. If someone is lowly, you don't look down on them. And also if someone is lowly, you don't give deference to them if they actually are in the wrong in the criminal case or even in a civil case. That you allow justice to be just, and that if there are other issues in the community, you don't use the system of justice to fix it, you use the community to fix it. You use other laws and other means of remedy at your disposal, not changing the legal decisions. Any other questions, or shall we dive into our commentary? Okay, so just going to go back up to our verses so that I can remind you of how we began, because this is where our commentaries are going to pick up. Is Moses is talking to them after discussing that there was an 11-day distance, and then reminding us that it may have been an 11-day distance, but it was a 40 years worth of travel. And that juxtaposition is going to trigger numerous commentaries, and we'll see where that will lead us. I promise it won't take 40 years. And let me zoom in the PDF so that's a little larger. Hopefully that is readable for everyone. I might be able to go in one more. Just one more. Don't want to get covered up with the pictures of the people who are attending, because I need to be able to see you guys if you're raising hands or things. All right. So we start off with a teaching from the Midrash about rebuke, because many of the commentaries, as we're going to see, consider this passage to be a passage of criticism, that Moses is criticizing the people of Israel. And they're going to start off with a very interesting lesson to be learned from Moses's timing of this criticism, of his rebuke. And we are taught that Moses rebuked the Israelites only close to his death, meaning he waited until he was about to die before he gave his full, honest appraisal of their behavior. From whom did he learn this, right? We learn that Moses chose to do it at this time. Who taught Moses that this was a good idea? From Jacob, who rebuked his sons only close to his death. As it is written in Genesis 49, and Jacob called to his sons and said, gather together, and I will reveal to you what will happen to you in the end of days. And then specifically when he addresses his son Reuben, Reuven, you are my firstborn. He said to him, implying within the conversation in the Torah in that passage, my son, I will tell you why I did not rebuke you all these years. You may remember that Reuben was criticized by the Torah, but we never heard Jacob himself criticize him for moving the couch of his father's concubine. It's a complicated issue. I'm not going to go into it, but Reuben definitely had misbehaved at that point. But we don't hear a direct criticism of Jacob to his son until this point. And why not? It is so that you would not leave me and go and cleave to Esau, my brother. So Jacob is saying, look, I was worried that if I had fully criticized you for what you had done, that you would have been so angry at the criticism that you would have left the household and gone to live with your uncle. And as we know, the Torah does not have a favorable opinion of Esau. So Jacob was willing to hold back on his criticism in order to prevent a worse outcome for his son. Everyone got that a basic idea? If you don't, they're going to summarize 4 reasons to wait in the next paragraph. And because of 4 things a man should rebuke another only close to his death, so that he not rebuke him repeatedly, meaning if I have to point out your error once, and I have to do this without expecting there to be significant change, then I'm going to end up having to criticize you over and over and over. Additionally, so that the other not be shamed in his sight, if I have to rebuke you in a way that you continue to behave in or that was especially egregious, then it's unfortunate that for many people, if they come to the point of criticizing another, that they will then look down upon that person permanently for all time afterwards. And that is not a healthy way to have a relationship. So that the rebuker not bear a grudge in his heart, meaning for his rebuke not being heeded. So if I rebuke someone and they don't listen to my advice, that's going to eat away at me. I'm going to feel very unhappy and angered that you are ignoring me. And so that the rebuke not leave him and go, as Jacob was worried, that sometimes rebuke can cause a person to flee. As we've talked in other classes, both Torah study as well as in my Pathway to Judaism class on words and how we govern our speech, rebuke is one of the hardest mitzvot to fulfill, one of the hardest challenges in any relationship. But we find out that rebuke leads to peace, meaning that it is still necessary and it is still beneficial when done correctly, right? Because we find this with Abraham, Genesis 21, and Abraham rebuked Avimelech, followed by in 27, and the 2 of them made a covenant. And thus do we find that Isaac, we also find it with Isaac, that Isaac said to them, why have you come to me when you hate me and sent me away from you? Followed by, and Isaac saw them off, and they went from him in peace. So we see that when rebuke is done correctly, in the examples of Abraham and Isaac, it can create peace between the 2 people. So it is not something that should always be avoided, and it's not something that should always be done. It's almost as though it is a nuanced point of life that cannot be reduced to a simple categorical statement. And the sooner we all learn that lesson, the better. We're going to get one more example of rebuke near death, 2 more from Joshua and Samuel. And thus do you find with Joshua that he rebuked Israel only close to his death, as it is written in Joshua 24, if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, the gods that your forefathers served, or the gods of the Amorites in whose lands you dwell. And I and my house will serve the Lord. So again, even though Joshua had been with them for so long, he is leaving them with this final warning that they need to pick to be with God rather than to serve the gods of the Canaanite nations that they had been in contact with. And thus do you find with Samuel that he rebuked Israel only close to his death, as it is written in 1 Samuel 12, here I am, meaning before my death, testify before me in the presence of the Lord and in the presence of his anointed. And they said, you have not robbed us. And went on that, yes, he had been a good judge. And he said, the Lord is witness unto you this day. And they said, witness. So the people did agree that he had grounds for complaining, that they were complaining against him because he had done nothing worthy of such complaints. So, any questions on how, with the additional lessons about rebuke aside, how the rabbi saw that this discussion was of Moses's about the 11 verses 40 was an issue of rebuke?
Rabbi, were the prophets tended to also rebuke, but obviously they were not on their deathbed. Is it? And do you think it had to do with the fact that they have already the authority from God to be able to fix whatever situation it is? Is that the reason why they could do it?
Well, they have the authority from God to speak the words God gave them. It's not that there's necessarily a promise that they will be able to fix the situation. It would take the people changing their behavior to fix the situation. But the harsh rebuke of the prophets is definitely given because their words were actually given to them by God. They weren't their own words, so to speak. They were just repeating what God wanted told. And other statements of rebuke that we find throughout the Tanakh have varying degrees of propriety and effectiveness. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Rabbi, in the book of Job, Elihu waits until the very end before he rebukes Job and his friends.
Yes, it's all the way at the very end of a very long book where we get God showing up and saying, you're wrong, but you're wrong for different reasons. And coming down, of course, ultimately on the side of Job. But again, God is exempt from the issue of whether it's good rebuke or bad rebuke, because we know that God does it right. All right, now you may be wondering, and perhaps you haven't piped up to ask, because you assume that I must have had a reason and you don't want to look silly by asking. Well, why should an 11-day journey and a 40-day time be necessarily considered to be a criticism? You might get some of the implication by it, but just to be sure, Rashi wants to set us straight. He's also quoting from Sifrei, that early collection of Midrash. Moses said to them, to the Israelites, see what you have brought about. There is no route from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea as short as the way through Mount Seir, and even that is a journey of 11 days. You, however, traversed it in 3 days. What? For see that they journeyed from Horeb on the 20th of Iyar, as it says in Numbers 10, and it came to pass in the 2nd year, in the 2nd month, on the 20th of that month. The cloud went up and the children of Israel journeyed out of the desert of Sinai. So they left the Mount Sinai in that 2nd year on the 20th of Iyar. And then as you do the rest of the math, and on the 29th of Sivan, they sent out spies to Kadesh Barnea, and they were there for 40 days. You can see the calculation more clearly in the Talmud on Ta'anit 29a. And if you take from these 30 days, the 30 days that they spent at Kivrot HaTa'ava, where they ate the meat for, quote, a month of days. That's the story of the quail, where the people were begging for meat and they ended up gorging for a month. And the 7 days spent at Hatzerot for Mitzrayim to be isolated when she was afflicted for Tzara'at after her undue criticism of Moses. It follows that in 3 days, they traversed all the way, right? If it is a 40 days of a trip, and you take out 30 days for eating quail, and you take out a week for waiting for Miriam, then that means you only had 3 actual days of travel. But we were just told that it was an 11-day journey. So apparently you could do the journey in 3 days in the right set of circumstances. Because to such an extent did the Shekhinah exert itself to hasten your coming to the land of Canaan. So basically what the Sifrei, the Midrash, is saying is if you do the math, the 11-day journey was done in 3 days, but those 3 days were because God was helping get them there quickly, and then they blow it. But because you became degenerate, meaning when they refused to go up because of the ill report of the spies and the people believing it, he made you travel around Mount Seir for 40 years. So you ended up being stuck there for 40 years because of your error. So God could move you faster than you could ever dream, 3 times faster than you could have done on your own feet. But you blew it and ended up being delayed 40 years rather than the normal walking time. So everyone sees that this rebuke is not just about you could have been there 40 years ago. It's God was even helping you get there faster than humanly possible. And yet you ended up messing up so badly that we had to spend 40 years. Is that clear? Questions, comments, reflections? All right, Chizkuni has a slightly different explanation, but we again see that there is a connection between these 11 and 40. Oh, excuse me, I think someone's trying to make a comment via that. Nope, that was just random phone notification. Sorry about that. It took them 11 days to cover the distance from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, the place from which the spies were dispatched. The fact is that no new commandments were revealed to the Jewish people after the return of the spies until the 40th year, after the last of the men of military age at the Exodus had died, and God's presence returned to be visible. All right, so I want to make sure you understand what he is bringing here. He is summarizing from other teachings, as we'll see, but what he is essentially saying is that from the moment the spies came back and everyone said, oh, we can't do it, and God put in the punishment of 40 years of delay, God was not giving any more commandments during that time. Right? God went quiet, if you will. God's presence was no longer as palpable to the point of having the commanding, literal presence for the people. That there was a distance between the nation and God that was triggered by their refusal to go up to the land of Israel at that time, and that distance was not overcome until they actually had the final people pass away from that 40-year cycle. Now,
Rabbi, I'm sorry to interrupt you. That means that Moses did not receive any word from God during that time? I thought I heard you.
So it's a little ambiguous about whether he received no word, but the idea of no new commandments seems to be more what the meaning of the Midrash is.
Okay.
Right? There were not any new commandments. And the way that this is found in the text is that we go back to our Deuteronomy 1, right? And it talks about, in 11 days, it was in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month that Moses addressed Israel in accordance with the instructions that the Lord had given for them, right? After he had defeated. That apparently, this is what they're saying, shows that new instructions came only at that point. That the instructions had been paused up until that point, which makes sense. Because what's the point of giving new commandments to a people who won't even fulfill the most basic commandment of go north? Right? If you can't follow the simplest of instructions, like walk that way, then why would God have continued to try to give them commandments during that period of rebellion? More to say on that a little bit later on. So Rabbeinu Bachya, as he often does, gives us a summary of how this all works together if we try to understand these 11 days in a broader context rather than being purely about the walking time. So according to Devarim Rabbah, the Midrash collection of the rabbis, the words 11 days from Horeb must be understood to mean that for only 11 days after leaving Mount Horeb could the people of Israel be described as perfectly committed to God. Right? So the first understanding in the Midrash is it was an 11-day march, didn't mean that it took 11 days to get there. It meant that for 11 days they walked with God, and for the rest they didn't. That their enthusiasm, their commitment, their dedication only lasted for 11 days. However, the Midrash goes on to say there are other opinions that actually say it wasn't talking about the 11 days of that. It was talking about the 11 days at Mount Sinai itself. we're going to see in this rest of this paragraph sort of a one-upsmanship of the different midrashim, trying to reduce Israel's commitment to God to a shorter and shorter time period. The Midrash speaks of the 40 days that Moses was on the mountain, right? Anytime you say 40, you're going to think of the 40 days on Mount Sinai. During the last 29 days, right, 29 plus 11, means that for 11 days they waited, and then for 29, they were already contemplating making the golden calf. So they were only perfectly committed to God for 11 days and then spent 29 days planning, and then, of course, after the 40th day, began making. Another opinion claims that the people remained completely loyal to God for only 2 days out of the 40 days that Moses had absented himself. The author of that view bases himself on Isaiah 58. As to me, they seek me out a day a day. The word in Hebrew, yom, is repeated doubly there, probably in context meaning daily. But this author of the Midrash is saying, no, read it literally. They sought me out 1 day and 2 days, and that was it. All right, the people were not actually connected and dedicated to God for more than 2 days. A third opinion claims that the people remain completely loyal for only a single day, basing itself on Deuteronomy 4, the day you stood before the Lord your God at Mount Horeb, meaning they were dedicated for 1 day and that was it. And yet another opinion claims that the people were not even totally loyal for an entire day, but committed idolatrous acts even on that very day. The source for such an extreme view is Isaiah 17. On the morning you sow, you see it bud, but the branches wither away on a day of sickness and mortal agony. The implication in this reading being that in the morning we were committed to God, but by the afternoon and by the evening, we were already withering away in our faith and commitment. Now, why are the rabbis going to such an extreme to try and say that the people were faithless so quickly? Does it mean that they all necessarily believe that it actually was that we rebelled that quickly? Not necessarily. But what the rabbis are each trying to say is that the people's faith in God was not necessarily something that was enduring and then diminished. The people of the past were not perfect in their faith, and then the people of the present, the ones with weak faith. Quite the opposite, they argue. The faith of our ancestors was often much more flexible, much more likely to fail than the faith of the people in the generation of the rabbis themselves. And so by trying to really exaggerate the quickness with which they abandon God, they are trying to give a sense of strength and purpose to the people of their generation and to our generation as well. And then he gives one additional insight that I think really clarifies this. Another approach to these words, 1 and 10, that's the Hebrew way of saying 11. There isn't a separate word, it's 10 and 1, or 1 and 10 rather, is to say, not to be understood as the word 11, as you normally would, but to have to be read separately. 1, 10, the first of the 10 commandments. I, Adonai, am your God, was the theological problem that the people could not deal with satisfactorily. Right? So what he is trying to say here, Moses reminds the people that the anger they caused God stems from their not accepting that commandment properly. So in a way, it's refining it down to the people had a problem with commandment number 1. They weren't even loyal 100% for part of the day, because as soon as God said, I am the Lord your God, they were already going, well, there was already slippage from the moment that commandment came out of their commitment. And that is, probably the most extreme version you can have of how fragile the faith of our ancestors were after they had left Egypt. Understandably, they had been saturated in idolatry and saturated in all of the horrible behavior of the Egyptians. You can't expect them to have been perfect pillars of moral virtue after that. But you might have hoped for a little bit more durability of faith after all God had done for them during the Exodus. All right, so our ancestors were weak. They were terrible. They ended up 40 years out on the wrong path. It was a travesty. And Moses is giving them the smackdown of everything that had happened. But remember, this had all happened in the past. The people that Moses is speaking to are not the people who built the golden calf. The people that Moses is speaking to are not the people who refused to go up to the land of Israel. All indications are that this group is ready. So how does this work out in our timeline? Why is Moses bringing this up now? Well, again, partly it's because he is about to hand over leadership to Joshua, and the people are about to actually go into the land of Israel. And Moses very much wants to make sure there is no repeat of their parents' mistakes, that the people who are about to enter learned from the mistakes of the past. And to understand, to learn from the mistakes of the past means to understand the mistakes of the past. And it's important, as we're going to see in the Midrash, to understand that the mistakes of the past were not so past for the people who were living at this moment, that they had been living in the shadow of those mistakes for 40 years, as a Midrash is going to make graphically clear. But actually, before I loop down to the next text, any questions or comments on Rabbeinu Bachia's interpretation here of the 11 days?
Rabbi, were there any other rabbis that actually believe that it may have been a positive situation, or pretty much everybody agrees that it was a time and a season that, you know, they continue to fail instead of growing?
Well, I mean, there definitely was growth. I mean, the people we see at the end of the 40 years are definitely a stronger and more committed nation than the people who were there 40 years prior. So that there absolutely has been progress. And the people do a pretty good job under Joshua of going into the land of Israel. It's not perfect, but they do a pretty good job of a very difficult situation. Unfortunately, we do find out after Joshua dies through the book of Judges that we're back to sort of the failing of faith over and over again in the community. It's not to say that individuals don't maintain their faith, but as a whole, the community's commitment continues to go up and down for a very, very long time.
Okay, makes sense now. Okay, thank you.
It's unfortunate, but yeah, it does make sense. All right, so moving on then to our Talmud text. Rav Dimi Bar Yosef said that Rav Nachman says, the 15th of Av was the day on which those designated to perish in the wilderness stopped dying. Like, what? Who? What? Okay, first of all, what is the 15th of Av? Well, the 15th of Av is the day that is just under a week after the day of Tisha B'Av. Now, Tisha B'Av is, as a reminder, is the day when we mourn the destruction of the first and second temples, but it's also the day that we mourn the decree that we would not go up to the land of Israel until 40 years had passed. According to the sages, all of those events happened on that same day, the 9th of Av. Now, the 15th of Av, the rabbis are interpreting as being the day on which that decree stopped, at the point at which that was no longer what was happening, as the entire generation that had left Egypt had died due to the sins of the spies. So the last person died on the last 9th of Av, we're going to see, and on the 15th of Av is when they realized no one else needed to die anymore, that we had finally finished. As I just said a second ago, they lived under this shadow, meaning that as people continued to die in the wilderness, they knew that they were dying in the wilderness rather than in Israel because of the crime that had been committed of refusing to go up into the land. So every time a person died, they were being reminded of that mistake. As the master says, as long as those designated to perish in the wilderness had not stopped dying, God did not speak with Moses. As it is said, so it came to pass when all the men of war were consumed and dead from among the people, in Deuteronomy 2:16, and followed by that, juxtaposed to it, that the Lord spoke to me saying in Deuteronomy 2:17, an even stronger indication that it was only after the last person died that we actually had God recommunicate to Moses again. When the Jewish people realized that the decree had been lifted, the day was established as a permanent day of rejoicing. It's not as widely known for many people because there are no religious obligations and no changes in our prayers. But the 15th of Av, what is called Tu B'Av, is considered to be an extremely happy and celebratory day. The Talmud says that it is the day that is happy, just like Yom Kippur is happy. Yom Kippur is supposed to be a happy day, of course, because it's the day when we feel most fit to stand before God because we have done the work of removing any of our transgressions and received forgiveness. And Tu B'Av, for a variety of reasons, but this is one of them, is considered to be the other most joyous day of the year. A lot of other people might put in Purim or maybe even Hanukkah or Pesach, but technically, according to the sages, Tu B'Av is the other day that shares the crown of first place in among days of happiness. Now, to understand how the sages saw this day and why it was such a happy day, rather than just, phew, we're done, we're going to do one more midrash, this time taken from Eicha Rabbah. This is the midrash written about the Book of Lamentations, and it continues as follows. Rabbi Avin and Rabbi Yochanan said, it was the day when the digging for the dead in the wilderness was canceled, which is a very strange sentence. What does he mean? Well, Rabbi Levi said, every afternoon of Tisha B'Av, left out a word in my translation there, Moses would proclaim to the whole camp, telling them to go out and dig. They would go out and dig graves and sleep in them. All right, so just picture this. It is the afternoon before Tisha B'Av, remember, coming up next week. And the people would go out in the afternoon and everybody would dig a hole for themselves and they would lie down in it. And then you'd wait to see whether you woke up the next day. So they don't see this as just being people dying of natural causes throughout the time in the wilderness for 40 years. They see this as being a mass culling every year of some of the people who were still alive, that had been alive and over the age of 20 at the time of the failure of the spies. Just put that into your conception of just, you've prepared yourself to die. And so you have literally gone to bed in your grave, not knowing if you're going to wake up. And then in the morning, Moses would proclaim, rise. And if you were still alive, you'd get up. And thus, they'd separate the living from the dead. In the 40th year, they did the same, but found that no one had died. Everyone got up in the morning, right? There were no bodies to be buried. They thought they had made an error in their calculations. Maybe we got the date wrong, right? Maybe it's not quite right. And they continued until the 14th. So they continued for multiple days each night, going to bed in a grave again and again and again, until they realized that God had canceled the decree against them, right? Once they saw the full moon of Tu B'Av, they knew that they couldn't have been off in their calculations that much, right? Once you reach the 15th of a Hebrew month, it's clear that you're not on the 9th or the 10th or another month. And they realized, we're done. The dying has stopped. And now we no longer need to go to sleep in our own graves, not knowing if we will wake up. And I find that, as you had mentioned earlier, Michelle, that the people growing, they definitely grew, I think, partly through experience like this. Whether it happened literally or not is less important than the fact that to know that at any moment you might die, to know that at any moment you might be called into account for what you had done, and to be prepared to accept that as having been appropriate, and to have prepared yourself and made arrangements in case it happens, takes a great deal of maturity and courage. And then to realize that the passing has stopped, that the dying is over, to recognize that not as just how fortunate I feel to have escaped, but to honestly rejoice and to set that as a day of continual reminder that we were able to get past that horrible mistake, that we were able to overcome the trouble that had been caused by our error of judgment when the spies returned and we listened to their erroneous report. That that set it as a marker so that we could learn from this forever, and that we could also have a day when it's a good day to rejoice. So this day of Tu B'Av comes as a very fitting antidote to the day of Tisha B'Av, to the day of sadness 6 days prior.
You know what, actually, Rabbi, you know what made me think about, remember that last year we had so many people that passed away back to back, you know, that you were going running here, running there, one Shiva here, one Shiva there. It made me think about that, you know, and now thank God we've had, you know, just a moment of peace, you know, where we haven't been attending that many Shivas, and in a way thankful. You know, I took the class with Susan Bernstein on Sunday, and we were talking about, you know, Kaddish and Kaddish Rabbanan and all these different things. And so she asked, you know, what was your perception of that? And I said, well, every time I participate in it, because I enjoy and I love, you know, the words, but at the same time I'm saying thank you, God, that I don't have anybody around me that I have to do it for. And it's so you either do one or the other. Either you're grateful that you have such wonderful prayers, or you're grateful that, you know, he has given you mercy and you haven't had to do the prayers. You know, it's interesting.
Absolutely, and certainly the morning mitzvot, the mitzvot regarding mourning are very powerful ways of helping to provide some structure and comfort during those difficult times. But we don't seek them out more than necessary, right? When it's needed, it's good that they are there, but Judaism doesn't believe that we should always be sleeping in a grave. We definitely want to climb out of that eventually.
And thank God for that.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? So just one little thing that struck me as I was reading through these midrashim again in preparation for the class, as we continue to have, you know, such a devastating illness in our own country and across the world, it may feel a little bit like we are just waiting to see who will get up in the morning, who will be able to survive another day. But recognize that although we certainly need to do all of our own efforts to make sure that we and those around us can continue to be healthy and survive, that eventually this will pass. Eventually the cases will go away, and eventually we will be able to have a moment of unabated rejoicing. Even as we are cautiously beginning to reopen with strict protocols this coming Shabbat, we recognize that we are not out of the woods yet. We are not done with this horrible illness and crisis, but we will eventually be there, and we will eventually be able to hug and dance together once we are past all of this. And hopefully that will be sooner rather than later, but that is up to us and our own choice of behaviors.
Amen.
So take care, everyone. Stay happy, stay healthy, and see you here or see you at distance, but in person.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, John.
All right, everyone. Take care.